On today's World Insight, China's 14th five-year plan in the works as key Chinese leaders gather for a plenary session. What the nation's socio-economic blueprint means for the next 5 years and beyond. And double whammy for multinational businesses dealing with a global economic crunch made worse with the resurgent pandemic. What it takes to survive from a business leader.
Market leaders with digital reinvention, they are actually performing much better than others.
Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. All systems go for the 5th plenary session of the 19th Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party of China here in the Chinese capital, Beijing, up to review our proposals of China's 14th five-year plan for economic and social development and the 2035 targets. 2020 marks the end of China's 13th five-year plan. Despite global troubles made worse with COVID-19, China is prepared to go full steam ahead to meet the goals. So what does the new top-level policy blueprint mean for the country, and what should be included in the future of design? Could it help bring stability to the world? Let's loop in our panelists. For the 5th plenary session of the 19th CPC Central Committee in Shenzhen, we are joined by Xiaogang Professor at Peking University HSBC Business School. In Beijing, Professor Fu Jun, Academic Dean of the Institute for South-South Cooperation and Development with Peking University also. In Washington, D.C., Surya Gupta, Senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Now, when we talk about the next five-year plan for China, we have to reflect back on the earlier 5 years. Professor Xiao, what about from your perspective, past 5 years, what has been done, what still need to be done, and certainly the new challenges?
Well, in the past 5 years, one key achievement is actually poverty alleviation. And another important achievement is really supply-side reform, which allowed us to avoid a number of potential bubbles. So the third one I would say is the sustainability concept, green growth, open, and all this innovative, inclusive, those are really become new normal today. But going forward, I think the major challenges comes from what we call the national security issue, which we don't really have, for almost last 40 years. So that related to the U.S.-China relation, and of course then the pandemic, which leads to the possibility of the link and the fragmentation of the global supply chains. So that's why we are going to see the so-called dual circle strategy, which is quite timely.
What do you consider, Professor Fu?
And compare that with the prospect lying down the road. Of course, a biggest variable that we have to deal with is the tensions, the geopolitical tensions that we face. In other words, with the previous advantage, resource, labor going down, and we have to focus on technology. And that means to make up for the shortfalls, the Chinese economy has to be more innovative. Yeah. Innovation.
Mr. Gupta, you are observing China from afar. What do you make of China's past 5 years?
China is at a very important stage in its economic transition, I would say economic transformation. And the 13th five-year plan, I think, was the really, really important plan because it was handling many of these issues related to this transition. I think Mr. Liu He had put it out very beautifully at Davos when he spoke a couple of years back, and he talked about a key necessity, which was to transform China from a high-speed growth economy to a high-quality growth economy. there was a main task which was to do supply-side restructurings to cut down on the overcapacity, and of course the critical battles on pollution, financial de-risking, etc., and poverty alleviation. So, I mean, this was a very broad agenda. And remember, just before that plan was put into action, we had the Made in China 2025 initiative. Now, that is the one which really caught the eyes of the US, especially the business community, because there were fears in the way it was going to be implemented. The principle was fine, but the way it was implemented was the issue. And at this point of time, the next 5 years will be a very delicate stage in terms of how many of those ideals, even though they have been downplayed somewhat because of the trade war, how those get implemented, particularly under the circumstances of the trade and technology war, which we are unfortunately in the midst of.
Very interesting analysis from all of you. Let's go into detail of some of these. Professor Xiao, we have been hearing from both Mr. Liu He and Mr. Wang Qishan over the past few weeks during some of the latest financial conferences that clear message has been coming out from China's side, reminding people about stability on financial issues and certainly in many other areas. So, Professor Xiao, how should we digest all of these latest messages?
Well, I think financial sector is extremely important for innovation because finance actually manages the so-called risk, so that the innovation basically has like a 90%, 99% failure. So if you do not have a good financial system to diversify the risk, then innovation will not be really possible. And that's why the U.S. actually has been advanced in finance. So that's why innovation there in the past has been very strong. But finance also means that it could have bubbles, it could have loopholes. So how to make sure it actually serves the real sector? That's really a challenge. And another thing is that finance is an ecosystem. It's very hard to use piecemeal policies to deal with finance. If you look at like we have China's financial system, but we also have like financial system in Hong Kong, right? And Hong Kong system is really strong in so-called external cycle, especially in IPO, raising capital. So that's why it's a very complicated sector. But it is a bottleneck for China's economy, and it is also a very important sector for global economy and for a lot of investors around the world, because China's economy is really now the strongest now from investor point of view.
Related to that, Professor Xiao, just to follow up, you also heard the latest speech given by Jack Ma, one of the most prestigious Chinese business person. So how do you make of his latest warning about the nature of banks in China?
Well, yes, it is very interesting. Jack Ma, he talked a lot about our outdated regulation, and financial systems, not the system. Yeah. But I would say that in China and in general, there are two issues here. One is how for the regulators to catch up with the innovation in the market. But on the other hand, we also have a challenge in the digital era because the platform companies, like Google and other companies, they usually have huge monopoly power. So there's a balance between strong regulation and too strong, then it would not allow innovation, new business model like Ant Financial, Jack Ma's Alibaba, and all this is really innovation. If you have very depressing, tight control, you cannot have this new business models. So I think we need to have some balance. And this balance is very tricky because you you have to, according to Chinese saying, touching stone, cross river by touching stone.
Right.
You have to really find out the reality there.
The wisdom is still with us, I hope. As you said, touching the stone while across the river. Mr. Gupta, when China is planning its plan, one of the most uncertain factors will be geopolitics. We have been witnessing or observing the process going up to the election in your country. We have been hearing from two candidates there during the campaigns, their rhetorics towards and against China. We have also been seeing apparently strategic encircling of China with efforts made by the United States, hopefully as it sees in partnership with its allies in Asia and elsewhere. So how do you see, China's plan vis-a-vis the uncertainty of geopolitics and how America will be changing on your own?
Yes, America is in a great process of transformation itself, political transformation itself, both for the good and for the worse. I'm hopeful that what comes out will be for the good in terms of a Biden presidency, which seems fairly, if not mostly likely. But that will not end the issue as such, because yes, of course, people have talked about Biden is going to have to move on the lines that Trump did move on. He might pull back a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. But one needs to think a little longer term than that. Biden himself is a fairly aged man. The U.S. is not going to have much growth for the next 3 years. I mean, the Federal Reserve has itself said that. And Mr. Biden might be staring at a re-election in 4 years' time with very isolationist or populist or even a very Cold War type Republican contender down the line. So regardless of what happens in this cycle, we must be prepared that the U.S. itself is in ferment. And the best thing that China can do at this point of time is continue doing reform at its end. It has international partners who want to see China do reform and succeed doing reform. And I can think of no one more important than the Europeans. China is in the process towards the final stages of negotiating its comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU, and these will have important disciplines on, of course, technology transfer, of course on IP, but also on issue of industrial subsidies and disciplines on state-owned enterprises. And this will, regardless of what happens in the US, this will release China from much of the pressure that it may face from groups of other countries geo-economically, because China will be willing to take those same commitments as advanced countries in many of these areas. Of course, we have geopolitics also, and we've seen with the Quad meeting and with the exercises, the naval exercises coming up, that there's an attempt to kind of encircle and contain China. Still at early stages, we need to see where it goes. But for China, the most important thing, I think, continue reform, and with many of its neighbors, the more amenable neighbors, try to resolve some of these sovereignty-linked disputes, some of these maritime disputes. Say the low-hanging fruit with South Korea or with the Philippines, they're not that difficult. So reform and being more amenable to resolving some of its strategic issues can definitely assist China's standing in the world.
Professor Fu, you've been working a lot on South-South cooperation, and therefore I would love to lead that question to you. ASEAN countries have already becoming the largest trading partner with China, and this is just a matter of fact. Meanwhile, you have also seen the geopolitics change. So how much China could get its momentum for inspiration for the next 5 years, given the latest development for its relationship with the developing countries and also some of the emerging economies?
Now, China today is a hybrid economy. You have a state, you have a market, and from a very rigid planning system, we have been moving towards market. It's halfway, and we should continue. And having said that, the benefits we have of reforming a very rigid planning economy to a hybrid economy This is what we have produced. We start from an economy that with the GDP per capita at roughly $150 US.
Okay.
Now to an economy 10,000, and it's sitting between advanced economy and a less advanced economy. Globally, we have a challenge to face. If you continue to see the widening gap of wealth between rich countries and poor countries, it's problematic. So China needs to do much more, serving as a bridge between advanced economies and the poor countries, so that in terms of global growth we are talking about, it is right for China to do more in terms of South-South cooperation. Having said that, we continue to need to work very closely with the advanced economies.
The challenge is, Professor Fu, all economies suffer as a result of COVID-19. Developing countries are going to be hit, and sometimes even harder, as we know through history.
Well, China has been arguing for multilateralism, and your case of COVID-19 support my argument, since this is something out of the blue, and it's a global challenge, and it's so important for advanced or countries like China to reach out to the poor part of the global economy. And for initial evidence, China has decided to join the global efforts once we have the vaccines, so that you increase better access on the part of developing countries. We are all in the same boat because it's a global challenge. Even when we argue, we are in the same ship, although in different cabins. But unless we get rid of, we have the wherewithal to deal with the disease, no country is safe. And this world economy is very interconnected, you know.
Right. Professor Xiao, before COVID-19 happened, we were already in a quite complicated stage of transformation of the world, I mean, in terms of geopolitics, technology, and many other things. Now, some suggest COVID-19 will exacerbate this process, apparently so, but others suggest that there could be other alternatives. Professor Xiao, what do you make of it? When China is making the plan, I know you've been working very closely with some of those who are in the process designing the plan. How should China consider all of these uncertainties and really come up with a reliable plan?
China basically used both the force of market, but also the role of the government, because in issues like the pandemic control and the infrastructure, government is very important, and China shows that. So I think now the world really are facing with the pandemic and the social inequality and the infrastructure and all these problems which China has rich experiences. And they are really useful for developing countries along the Belt and Road, and even for advanced economies. So I think our new plan and also some of the longer plan, 15 years, 30 years plan, basically are trying to not consolidate our domestic economy, but also improve the understandings by the world about what China are doing. China is really doing something, I think, very important for the future of the world, because China helped to elevate so many people out of poverty, extreme poverty, and is developing using something which is not inconsistent with the Western, economy's basic philosophy, sustainable development, equity, and even freedom. So I think the problem is that China and the rest of the world needs more communication, more understanding, and this understanding sometimes you need to have some really fight. It's not really war. It's like you have different opinions. You have to debate. You have to argue. And what we are seeing happening is this. And China has difficulties to communicate with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world also the same have difficulty. So that's why I think in the dual circulation strategy, the external sector in China is going to be open continuously. And Hong Kong is a Chinese city, but foreigners can understand it very easily. So Shenzhen, Greater Bay Area, and a lot of our cities like Hainan, Freeport, they're all going to be very, very open and systematically open, so that the world will be easier to understand China and easy to connect, to integrate with China.
It's very interesting that you mentioned, and also significant that you suggest that in the plan there should be an important component throughout of it about how China needs to communicate with the rest of the world, and how China would incorporate this kind of communication in various areas which it is working on. Mr. Gupta, it's important to help others understand yourself, but it's also important that others do not intentionally, at least, try to misinterpret it as a result of geopolitics. And misinterpretation, miscalculation, misjudgment lead us to
absolutely.
devastation. Go ahead.
Sure, you're absolutely correct on that. What I would say is that, this is the year when COVID happened, and this was also an election year with Donald Trump, and therefore there was this determination almost to mischaracterize and be dishonest on a lot of the issues. Hopefully, once we move beyond this phase, and we will be in this phase because COVID is not going away. Even if we have a vaccine, it will still be some time before we can transition away, including in terms of the economic effects. But what China used to do very well was have spokespersons of foreign countries speaking on behalf of China, and the business community used to be a very important component of that. And that business community did lose some amount of confidence in China as to whether it was really reforming. But in the last 2 to 3 years, that opinion within the business community itself is that, yes, China is moving in a good direction. It is making those reforms. They are being implemented now. But that implementation still needs to go some way further, and there needs to be further reform. And they will be oftentimes the best spokesperson. I would also suggest that, in China, that communication, it's always easy, and therefore the broader the range of voices which kind of adumbrate the points that China wishes to make, communicating China's message to the world in terms of its peaceful development, in terms of its reform strategies. But maybe if there can be some of the sovereignty-linked disputes in Asia can be resolved, not just managed, that will show, yes, see, China can do this and has done this. And even on the reform front, we've seen major moves in terms of unforced technology transfer with the foreign investment law. That's in terms of intellectual property. There have been some very profound movements in this within the past year and a half. And let's see, also on terms of industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises, if we can have far-reaching reforms on those fronts, commitments made in these bilateral and plurilateral trade agreements, that will immediately squelch the grounds for much of the miscommunication. And so let's see in these areas where China goes, but I think that would be the means rather than try to centralize communication and then put and shout it out. I think the more nuanced way is a better way for China to move forward on this front.
And of course, just to add to that, all the agreements need efforts from all parties in the agreement.
No question.
Thank you so much for all of you for joining us. I know we are talking about a gigantic topic. I'm sure we're going to have future opportunity to come into some details of all the important directions you've been pointed at. Thank you so much, Professor Xiaogeng, Professor Fu Jun, and Mr. Sura Gupta. Thank you so much.